And can we start now? When does it?
Yeah, go ahead and start.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here this afternoon for this both live and virtual conversation that I'm going to have with Jonathan Darman. I'm Bill Harris, the director here at the library, and Jonathan has written a very fascinating book called BECOMING FDR. And so before we get to that, if you have questions when we get to that portion, a microphone will be brought around to you. And also virtual audiences, feel free to send a question forward too. So now, Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah.
It's a great honor to be here at the FDR Library, which is such an important resource for me in working on the book, and is such a great testament both to the vision of Franklin Roosevelt and also the stewardship of the National Archives in providing such an amazing resource for scholars that'll last for generations.
Well, that's great. We're here, and the National Archives is here to provide that sort of evidence so that people can write and research, and we can have informed conversations based on that, and not just our opinions or our prejudices or biases, one hopes. So you've written before about Reagan and LBJ, a landslide, I believe, was the name of that book, and now about FDR, who had a couple of landslides of his own. That's right.
I actually started out on FDR coming out of that project, because this is not something that people necessarily think about, but my first book looked at Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan in the 1960s, and they were actually generational peers. They were born only 3 years apart, even though they were presidents in two very different eras. And one of the things that they had in common was Franklin Roosevelt. He was both of those two presidents' ultimate hero. And I think each of them saw sort of key elements of his own personality in Roosevelt. So for Lyndon Johnson, whose presidency was all about doing, accomplishing, getting big bills passed, FDR was the sort of model he was trying to beat. And that had been sort of ingrained in Johnson's mind early in his life, in his political career. On the day that FDR died, Johnson was out there with reporters crying and saying he was like a daddy to me. And then Reagan, interestingly, a lot of people obviously might think, Ronald Reagan saw himself as another Franklin Roosevelt. That doesn't make sense given their sort of position on the ideological spectrum. But it was really when the young Ronald Reagan listened to Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats that he was totally captivated. And he would do this impersonation with a fake cigarette holder in his hand and all of that. And it sort of got this idea in his head that, wow, the realm of politics is a place where you can be a performer who forms a connection with millions of people that you're never going to know. And so FDR was a hero to Reagan as well. So in thinking about those two men, I sort of inevitably thought a lot about Franklin Roosevelt. And then when it came time to start working on my next book, I had thought about him enough that I really wanted to spend some time trying to get inside of his head.
And of course, in a fascinating way, Reagan certainly had a transformation over time as his politics evolved from a New Deal, I would say a Roosevelt Democrat through the 50s into what he became, which was a sort of, now it seems like a very old-fashioned type of conservative. And this book is also about transformation.
That's correct.
And about change and evolution of an individual. If you haven't read it, I recommend it, Becoming FDR, The Personal Crisis That Made a President. In terms of this topic, lots of people have written on various aspects of this, or the president and his personality and how it may have changed. What brought you to this topic?
So when I start out a project, I did this with my last book and I did it with this one, I sort of start with a question that feels relevant to the world that we're in today. And it can be often a simple question. And with this time around, the question was, how does a president form a bond with the people that he is charged with leading and bring them hope? How does he or she, hopefully someday, convince the American people that in a time of challenge, that things are not only going to get better, but that together they can do big things? So I sort of started thinking about that. I got very quickly to FDR, and I thought that the book I was going to write was going to look at his presidency. Because as people in this room well know, Franklin Roosevelt is about as good an example as we have of a president who was able to bring hope to the country through his leadership during the Depression and World War II. I thought the book would deal with the presidency. I thought I was going to talk about his experience with polio in, maybe half a chapter. I thought that I knew the whole story of polio. I thought its significance was chiefly the steps that Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors took during his presidency to conceal the full extent of his disability from the public, and the sort of code of silence that existed alongside that in the press. But as I sort of really dug into the research and spent time thinking about what it was like to be Franklin Roosevelt, I very quickly came to see that the polio story was something totally different. And I was sort of clued into that in a number of ways. One was looking at the difference between FDR before and after polio. If you spend time here at the museum, you'll know that Franklin Roosevelt had a whole career in politics that preceded his getting polio at age 39. And that was very much, his identity in those years was very much based on his physical presence and being an attractive, athletic young man. And really having a lot of different skills than he had later on in his career. I found it by sort of reading the testimony of the people who knew him best. Eleanor Roosevelt described when she was reflecting on Franklin's experience recovering from polio, and she said it was what forced him to reckon with the fundamentals of living for the first time. Louis Howe, who's an important character in my book and is someone who's well known at this place, he reflecting on the years that FDR spent recovering from polio, said a year or two in bed should be prescribed for all of our statesmen, which I'm sure that some of us in the room can think of one or two statesmen that we'd like to send to bed for a couple of years. And really, though, I think what drove it home for me was reading FDR's correspondence with other polio patients. And I did it right here at the library. Because Franklin Roosevelt was, when he got polio in the summer of 1921, and it was when it was announced to the public that fall, he was a well-known figure. He had been the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket the year before. And polio was not a disease that people very much associated with adults. So when it gets announced that he has polio, or as it was known at the time, infantile paralysis, a lot of other polio patients started writing him letters. Some of them were seeking advice. They wanted to know what he was doing in his own recovery, but some of them were offering advice. And I was particularly struck by one letter from a gentleman who came from a very different background from Franklin Roosevelt. He'd been a railroad worker in Massachusetts. He was fully paralyzed by polio. He spent 7 years in a hospital recovering from its effects. And he wrote FDR a letter in which he described the ways that rage and fear and shame had impeded his recovery. And in that letter, he said, "Mr. Roosevelt, whatever you do, don't worry, it won't help any." And when I read those words for the first time, I could see a straight line from that to the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so really that's what drew me to the story and felt like the unique story that was to be told here.
And there are multiple transformations that occur in this book as well. Well, multiple on the personal level is apart from polio, even from 1919 to 1921 or so, yeah. And as well as those around him. So you see him changing and becoming the person that he would become. And you also see those around him having to and wanting to, or seeing an opportunity to evolve as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the most, in a lot of ways for me, the most fascinating and exciting to work on in this book was the transformation that's happening in parallel in Eleanor Roosevelt's life. So my book starts a couple years before FDR gets polio in the late 19-teens, in the aftermath of World War I. And you look at Eleanor Roosevelt's life in those years, and it's really sort of her low point. The Roosevelts were living in Washington in those years, where FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt had just gone through the great crisis of their marriage, which was his affair with her social secretary, Lucy Mercer, an affair that Eleanor had discovered and had left her feeling deeply betrayed by her husband, but also humiliated. And in the aftermath of that, I think she was sort of lost. She didn't really have a sense of what her purpose was or what she should do with her life. And she certainly in those years didn't really think that being a big public figure on the public stage was going to be the future for her. The example I think of that really sort of illustrates this for me is in that 1920 campaign when Franklin was running for vice president, a reporter tracked down Eleanor and asked her, what do you think about the issue of women's suffrage? And women's suffrage in 1920 was a big issue. That was the first year that women had the right to vote nationwide under the 19th Amendment. And Eleanor Roosevelt's response was, I don't have a strong feeling either way. Personally, I'm content with my husband and my children. Eleanor Roosevelt? And within just a few years, it's getting back to the point of transformation, within just a few years of her saying that, she's not only going to have an opinion about whether women should have the right to vote and be at the center of things in American politics. Obviously, she thinks they should. She herself is going to be one of the most significant women in either of the two parties, with an issue set and an agenda that's totally independent from her husband. And a lot of things bring that about, but one of the really important ones are the circumstances surrounding Franklin's polio. After FDR gets polio in the fall of 1921, he sort of, with Louis Howe, the Roosevelts develop a plan for his eventual return to politics. And a chief part of that plan is going to require FDR devoting himself a lot to most of his life for a few years' time to trying to gain recovery and get better. And so there's this need for someone to be keeping the Roosevelt name out in front of the public. And Eleanor Roosevelt is nominated for that, and she steps into that void at first kind of gingerly, but she discovers very quickly that world, which is a world of ideas and of action and of being a public figure, is really the place that she was always meant to be. So, I mean, what was really enlightening for me in working on this is seeing how their two transformations are happening in parallel. And at the same time, they're really sort of reinventing their marriage from that place of brokenness into this new union that is complex and is based on their shared ability to remake themselves and also their shared goal to really ease suffering in the world.
So when we speak of these transformations, especially since we're focusing on President Roosevelt, today we have the FDR before 1921, and we have the FDR after 1921. What was that personality like beforehand? And do you see a point? Can you, through your research and in the evidence that of this period, do you see a point? Does this transformation begin to emerge? Was it the seed there already, and hardship, adversity caused it to grow? What was that like from before to after?
Two really great questions in there. So to begin with, the pre-polio FDR, I think of that person, when I think of him, my mind and automatically goes to two words, which is Teddy Roosevelt. The pre-polio FDR is someone who, for most of his adult life, has been doing a pretty good Teddy Roosevelt impersonation. Franklin Roosevelt grew up here in Hyde Park in sort of this atmosphere of great love, great privilege, but also great isolation. He didn't spend a lot of time around other children. And so when he first went off, first to boarding school and then to college, he wasn't beloved by his peers. He didn't feel like the world thought he was particularly special. And in his sophomore year in college, his famed fifth cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, is catapulted into the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley. And all of a sudden, having the last name Roosevelt is a pretty big deal. And I think not coincidentally, not long after that, Franklin Roosevelt gets the idea that he himself wants to go into politics. And he pretty methodically sets about sort of trying to be the Teddy Roosevelt of the Democratic Party in the next generation. He goes about having all the jobs that Teddy had had. He gets elected to the New York State Legislature. He is appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he gets to Washington, and that's where you really see this Teddy Roosevelt impersonation taking off. He uses the word bully a lot in conversation. I'm a former journalist. He discovers that journalists in Washington can be a little bit lazy, and that they like it when you provide them with a story. And so the story he provides them is, here's another Roosevelt in the Navy Department. And that works for him. I mean, he sort of runs around all the time. He's the vigorous young man. It works for him in terms of getting attention. But none of the sort of things that really are going to distinguish Franklin Roosevelt in his own presidency, the strategic thinking, the sort of oratorical presence, and most important, I think, the great capacity for empathy and the sort of sense of mission to ease suffering in others, those aren't really present in FDR's pre-polio career. And remind me where we were in the second part of the question. Yes.
Did you see through your research, and I'm sorry about the lengthy and multiple questions, I'll do it continuously.
Okay, I look forward to it.
Absolutely, just file them away, try to, because I might forget them myself. Yeah. Did you see the seeds of any evolution or change in him before?
Yeah, I mean, I almost think you can pinpoint the moment. So he gets polio in late summer of 1921. And just think about what that's like for him, having been that person who was trying to do the Teddy Roosevelt impersonation, the young man in a hurry. He gets this diagnosis, which in 1921, getting a polio diagnosis was about as terrifying a diagnosis as you can get. And he's lost the ability to walk. So this whole plan that he's devoted himself to in his life of being Teddy Roosevelt, all of a sudden it seems like it's out of reach. And I think, as a lot of people know, there were people around Franklin Roosevelt in those days who were saying you should give up on politics. Not insignificantly, his mother, who's Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, and I even speaking those words around here, I am a little bit careful.
She's here.
She's here, exactly. But she was saying, okay, why don't you come back here to Hyde Park and live a comfortable life, as an invalid and a country squire. But there's one really important dissenting voice, and that's Louis Howe, who had been with the Roosevelts since early in Franklin Roosevelt's career. He had sort of pinned his own professional and personal ambitions on Franklin's advancement. And I think he's a lot more of an emotionally sensitive guy than we typically associate with political consultants, not particularly known to be an emotionally sensitive crowd. And a lot of political advisors, when the candidate that they've devoted themselves to all of a sudden has this illness and disability that's going to knock them out of commission for years, they might start looking for someone else to sort of hitch their wagon to. Louis Howe moved into the Roosevelt's house because he wanted to devote himself full time to FDR's recovery. And I think this is where the emotional sensitivity comes in. He understood that if FDR was going to recover, he needed some vision of a future that he could believe in and something that he was working towards. So he goes to Franklin Roosevelt and he says, I know other people are saying your political career is finished. I not only believe you're going to return to politics, I believe you're going to be the president of the United States. And I've got this detailed plan for how we're going to do it. And FDR's response is, when do we start? And that's the moment, I think, where you begin to see that transformation. It's FDR staring down what is going to be the great challenge of his life and understanding that he's going to have to give up a lot of what he has known up to that point to become what he needs to be, and saying, okay, I'll do this. That's a big moment, I think, of personal decision.
So we've got political ambition always there, of course, and a drive. And then you have mixed into this now, to a degree, a helplessness of having to rely upon people, needing people to actually assist him in really every aspect of his existence, except his thoughts, except his mental acuity and his capacity for new ideas. How does that political ambition align or detract from or foster that sense of empathy that develops because of his illness?
I think that it's a great question, because I think that on an abstract level, he had always had, and as part of his, what we would call ideology, a concern for others. And he came by it honestly. His father, James Roosevelt, if you read the book or other books, you know is someone who really believed that as children of privilege, the Roosevelts had an obligation to help people who had less than they did. And he instructed the young FDR in that. And I think that was a sort of guiding principle of FDR's career as he pursued his ambition and went into politics. But it was always abstract in the years before polio. And he sort of had this idea that to do good, he first had to become great. So he could put all his energy into his own ambition and his own advancement, and then, do things for others down the line. And that's really the big shift that comes after polio. Is he starts, I think he's awakened to what suffering is like for the sufferer. And so he starts thinking about things that he can do to help other people without even thinking about how it's going to help his career. When you look at his experience, we can talk about this at Warm Springs, Georgia, which is a place where he spends much of his time in the 1920s. He's devoting himself there not just to his own recovery, but really in a lot of ways to making it a haven of recovery for other people with polio. And you can be the most cynical person in the world looking at assuming that politicians do everything out of some kind of personal ambition or calculation. There's no way that it makes sense for Franklin Roosevelt to be spending that much time thinking about others. I think it's a moment of him genuinely opening up to what other people are going through and thinking about, okay, what can I do to help them right now? And
it's interesting that Warm Springs, I have a couple of questions from before then, but since it's here in front of us, it's fascinating to me that Warm Springs is such an overt public, in a way, recognition of his illness and the results, and that he dedicates himself, and he really does, I agree, and both through money and through effort and through political action as well. And yet the paralysis had to be secret. And yet at the same time he's doing, how in the 20s is he trying to both get his political career back in line and yet also doing this other thing which goes kind of against, they seem it. I mean, as you know well, with Franklin Roosevelt, there are a lot of different things happening, moving in opposite directions. But I think on the sort of question about secrecy, the story in the 20s is a little bit more nuanced and complicated, because it's true, we all do associate the sort of the concept of deception and secrecy with FDR's disability. And it's true that from the moment they go public with the fact that he had infantile paralysis, there is a campaign to frame it in the best possible light. So the article announcing it in the New York Times has a quote from his doctor that says, "No one need have any fear of a permanent disability," which they knew was not true when they said that. And all of the stories about FDR's illness in the 1920s that appear in the press, he's always about to have a complete recovery, and he had a hard time, but it's about to be, he's almost there, which was also not true. At the same time, if you were reading the newspaper in the 1920s and you were at all interested in Franklin Roosevelt, you knew that he had polio. You knew that it had robbed him of the ability to walk. You might have even seen pictures of him at Warm Springs, where you could see that his body had really been transformed by the illness. And sometimes you could even see him talking quite frankly and openly about what a challenge it had been for him personally. And I think what was interesting to me in working on this is, as he sort of ultimately reemerges in politics in the latter part of that decade, polio is actually part of the story. It's a way of, when you're reintroducing Franklin Roosevelt to the public, you can, to use a term we would use today, humanize him. He's had this big challenge and he's overcome it.
And so I think that's really important in understanding his bond with the public, because even though the public didn't know the full extent of his disability, the sort of atmospherics of someone who had had serious illness and overcome it was something that people were very much aware of.
Do you think that the sort of noise and the constant motion and activity in the country in the 1920s, did the sort of general sense of the decade play in any way into your thinking as you looked at how FDR is slowly making his own transformation, yet it's in this period of great bustle?
That to me is where what he is able to do in this period is quite remarkable on a personal level, because he has up to that point always been the man in the hurry, and he's living in the 1920s, which is, as you say, this moment of everything speeding up. I think about Henry Luce and Brighton Haddon launching a weekly news magazine in 1923, and they call it Time, because that's the thing that everyone doesn't have enough of, everyone wants, everyone needs, everyone's obsessed with, is this sort of rapid passage of time. And if you're Franklin Roosevelt and you get this diagnosis, and this path for recovery, if it exists at all, is going to take years of sort of slow drudgery. That the anxiety that must have created or that would have created in most people, of just sort of the possibility that the world is going to leave you behind. But he's able to sort of get through that and do what he needs to do in those years, which is actually slow down and not, Louis Howe talked about how before polio, he could always sort of just jump off to the next thing. Anytime he was presented with something challenging, he could distract himself. He didn't have that ability as easily. He had to sort of look and learn to tolerate the hard things. And that's, I think, something that brings about a great leap forward for him. And so really, even though we think of him as someone who's so great at reading public mood, the important work that he does in the 1920s is going against the sort of tide of the current in many ways and focusing on his own inner development.
Well, let's step back and think about this interregnum, I'll call it, between his active self and between what emerges, this period after he has had his diagnosis, after polio, but before there's, let's say, hope, that there's this notion that he may move forward. Who did he have around him, and how did he navigate that period as he considered whether there may be a future or not?
I think, Eleanor and Louis Howe are the sort of the essential pillars of the early years of his recovery. And the first winter of his recovery in 1921-22, it's a bleak period. Because he's sort of he's isolated in a lot of ways and one of the things that isolates him is his own sort of congenital optimism, and when he's corresponding with his friends and intimates, he's saying, "Oh, everything's going to be great. This has not been an issue for me." And I came to appreciate how that really isolated him in a lot of ways, because then when people would encounter him in person, they could see that his experience had been much more serious than he had led them to believe. And there's this sort of gulf that emerges there between what he's experiencing and what he's projecting to the world. It's a very hard period for Eleanor, because she is in those first months really having to do backbreaking labor caring for her husband. They're not here. They're in the Roosevelt's townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And when I think of Eleanor in those months, she's just sort of going up and down the stairs all the time, taking care of her husband. And there's this moment where, Franklin Roosevelt is, as people here may know, is always worried about, are we spending too much money, and are we looking for ways to save? And he sort of in passing says, maybe we should, he has a nurse taking care of him. He says, maybe we don't need the nurse, and Eleanor can just take care of me. And you want to just sort of shake him in that moment, like, you can't do this to your wife. And so it's a really challenging period. But then, interestingly, it just sort of opens up into, as he gains more confidence in his sort of medical picture and his recovery, he gets this idea that he can seek out, that he's uniquely positioned in a lot of ways to seek out the best medical wisdom in the world about what you do to encourage muscle recovery after polio. And he sets his sights on this idea of he's going to walk again. And he does something that I think a lot of patients of serious illness will do in time, which is sort of gather the best available evidence, but really synthesize it and come up with his own program for what he's going to do. And I think, when I look at that, I see the seeds of a lot of what he's ultimately going to do in his presidency is, and particularly in facing the Great Depression, is sort of take advice from experts in economics about, different paths he could take, but then come up with his own synthesis. It's not based in any one particular theory. It's based in what makes sense most to him.
Do you think the period where he on the Roca and down in Florida, and the sort of view that you have if you go through the scrapbooks, do you think that was just one last sort of, what would I say, almost release from everything so that he can come back recharged? Or was it reflective of sort of he still hadn't decided? Or
I think that he got this idea in the first couple of years of his recovery that swimming was going to be essential to his recovery. And it's just because it's logical. You get in the water as a paralysis victim, and you feel all of a sudden weightless, and you have a sort of power that you don't have in other places. So he tries swimming therapy, and he loves it. He's addicted. So he wants to go down to Florida on these houseboats so that he can have a sort of winter of therapy. He also had these ideas.
Multiple kinds of therapy.
Yes. Yes. I mean, there's a lot of hijinks that go on those boats.
That's the word.
Wonderful to read. This is a period where there was a log that they kept on board the ship. And most of the time, when FDR was not, as those of us who study him and people here well know, he was sadly not a great diarist. He certainly didn't write down what his innermost thoughts were about anything. And most of the time in his life where he did keep a journal or a diary, it was probably because he wanted a record of what he was thinking. So he kept a diary in the period around World War I, sort of there, so that he could his position on issues could be tracked. But the Roca log is sort of anomalous in this respect, in that it doesn't serve any purpose for him. It's just sort of, you get to see his humor and his mind wandering. And I think that he comes to appreciate in these years that those kind of days have a real benefit for him, that he needs time in the sun, letting his mind wander. And that's going to be an important tool of his in the presidency, facing down just historic challenge, this knowledge that he needs sometimes to get away into the sun and to not be thinking about it on the surface and letting himself solve problems underneath.
Well, we think of that even here at the library. He would come over to his office and sit on the floor with the director and sort through books that he wanted. This sort of, while France is falling, this sort of way of escape to yet recharge and regroup your thoughts so you can move forward or feel engaged.
Right.
But again, you see this interesting contrast going on in the 20s as well, between this sort of this Warm Springs world, which is so very casual and relaxed, and a place where he engages with people on a deeply personal level, really, the way he wouldn't do about his health or anyone's health for that matter. And you've got the New York State politics and national politics, which is so very different.
Yeah.
So what's going on with his political reemergence in terms of the party, Democratic Party, and within New York State?
So I agree with the premise that in most ways the two things are totally unrelated. And I think you really do have to appreciate how deeply engaged he gets at Warm Springs in things that have nothing to do apparently with politics. So he goes down there for the first time in 1924, seeking his own recovery. But very quickly, he starts thinking of it as a place where he can help other people. He does ultimately invest a large portion of his own personal fortune to buy Warm Springs and sort of start executing this vision that he has for how it can be a center of rehabilitation for others. And I was amazed by how personally involved he got with patients' care down there. You can read, a medical report from there where it describes, this patient came here, they had the use of this muscle and this muscle. Now they have the full use of this muscle and this muscle. They walked this amount before, now they can walk this amount. And then at the bottom, the person who's written the report signs his name, and it's Franklin D. Roosevelt. And that's striking in a lot of ways. And to me, it's sort of bittersweet because he's taking great pride in those people's recovery, even as Warm Springs is failing to bring the same kind of recovery to him in his own quest to walk again. So while all of that is going on, he is still mindful.
Just to interrupt,
Yeah.
and it's Warm Springs, Georgia.
Yes.
And I'm from the Deep South, the rural Deep South, is the rural Deep South.
Yes.
It is as far away from here in the Hudson Valley as you could possibly get.
I think, and now this is where the complexity comes in, because his mind is always operating on several levels. He has been a student of the Democratic Party in the 19-teens and the 1920s. He had his great sort of first moment of reemergence at the 1924 Democratic Convention, which is a sort of famously fractious moment in the history of the Democratic Party. I think they went for 102 ballots before they arrived at a presidential candidate. And it's because the party was sort of divided between two corners of its base. There's the sort of old Southern Democratic Party, which was white and segregationist. And there was the emerging Democratic Party, which was large organizations in large cities drawing on the increasingly large immigrant populations in those cities. And the sort of problem of how you can combine the very different agendas of those two pieces was very much something that was on his mind. And he knew that he came from New York State. He was associated with New York. And that would make him automatically suspicious to that Southern Democratic corner of the party. So he viewed it as advantageous that he was having a reason to be spending a lot of time in the Deep South, developing relationships with Southern politicians. And you really see it when he starts to reemerge as a national figure. The Georgia press will talk about him as an adopted son of Georgia. And he sort of neutralizes that problem for himself that a lot of other Northern politicians had up to that point. Now, I think from a sort of judgment of history perspective, it comes at a great cost, because this is one of these moments I think about as sort of a time in our history where our best and worst impulses are uncomfortably close together. So Warm Springs, Georgia, which is, I think, unquestionably the place that unlocks Franklin Roosevelt's tremendous capacity for empathy, is also, I think, in a lot of ways, the setting for his greatest failure of empathy. He's spending all this time in the segregated South in the 1920s, and he doesn't get animated by the cause of civil rights. And you can say, okay, that's excusable because there were plenty of other white progressive politicians who hadn't adopted civil rights. But I think the greatest argument against that is Eleanor Roosevelt. She goes down to Warm Springs with Franklin for the first time in 1924. She notices it right away. They're being shown around the area, and their hosts sort of point out a school that they've built for the poor children of the area. And Eleanor says, well, it's a school for white children. Where do the black children go to school? And she never really gets comfortable at Warm Springs. And that's the preview of a tension that's going to exist in their marriage for the rest of Franklin's life, where she's out in front of him on civil rights, and it is a failing of it. So it's a complicated mix there, where with the deeply personal and inspiring at Warm Springs, and then at the same time the cynical politics, which is always going to be part of the FDR story.
And cynical politics, the 20s, New York City and New York State. You've got Tammany still. You have Al Smith, Jimmy Walker down in the city.
Yep.
It was just a minefield of that no politician would want to have to deal with. And that's just the state of New York.
Yeah. I mean, and he had, this is something that Franklin Roosevelt had spent a long time learning about, going back to that young man who did the Teddy Roosevelt impersonation. So Teddy Roosevelt, when he'd gotten to the New York Assembly, had sort of made a name for himself as a reformer and an enemy of Tammany. And Franklin Roosevelt, coming to the state Senate a generation later, tries to do the same thing. He makes this big, splashy arrival there as someone who is an opponent of these bosses and is going to be for reform in the Democratic Party. It doesn't actually work out that well for him. And he starts to learn in the course of his political career that he actually, if he wants to succeed statewide in the Democratic Party, he needs to make a sort of peace at the very least with Tammany. And so he does a pretty masterful job in this period that I write about of keeping relations friendly with Tammany Hall at the same time as he burnishes his national reputation as someone who is a New Yorker who is not tainted by Tammany Hall. And he's able to pull off that dance in a way that he was never able to do in the years before polio. And I think it's an early sign of how he's become, in a lot of ways, a whole new political animal.
It's interesting too, though. He doesn't really address head on, just like he won't, because he saw it, of course, down south. He knew what the world was there and chose to look away or to not address it. But the same in New York, really.
Yeah.
Tammany was going to just sort of be Tammany. And he wasn't going to be a crusader against it, because, and that just comes across to me throughout the 20s, really throughout his life in many ways, but in the 20s especially, this, and that's where the empathy probably helps leaven the pure, hardcore politics, but it never overcomes that.
And I think that those same years have strengthened the strategic ability. So when you are before polio, you're a young, attractive, athletic guy who everyone sort of makes a fuss over. You don't need that much strategic ability because most rooms you walk into, things are going to turn out pretty well for you, particularly if you're white and male in the 19-teens. When you have a disability and you are removed from the political stage, and you're plotting a multi-year return that's ultimately going to land you in the White House as someone who's in a wheelchair or uses a wheelchair, you need strategic ability. And I think something he gets out of the polio years is this idea that he doesn't have every option available to him. He can't do everything. And he needs to prioritize his own self-interest in a lot of areas as a way of doing the big things that he wants to accomplish. So that can sometimes be an excuse for selfishness or for ignoring important issues like corruption or like racial injustice. But it's all part of this sense of his that he's only got a limited time and he's only got so many chances. And that really is a big message that gets driven home by the experience of polio.
Isn't it fascinating? It seemed so easy before, didn't it? Because he was a good-looking white man with wealth and privilege that afforded him all sorts of opportunities. Not that he didn't work for them, but he didn't have to work quite as hard until polio, and he had to physically work as well as like you say, plan. Do you think that new drive helped move him forward? The notion that you did have to struggle and work for it, did that give him greater focus?
I think unquestionably. He has this idea. What he's trying to do is so outlandish in a lot of ways. And he has this idea that he's going to achieve this thing, but it requires a great deal of patience. And that, patience is first of all the experience of trying to recover. Everything that he had done, he had this sort of, before polio, he had this sort of pretty basic idea of mastery, which is you try something, you're not very good at it. You try a little harder and all of a sudden you get better and then it's really easy. Trying to regain the ability to walk again after polio was not like that because he had inherent limitations on his physical ability. And I think the first years were quite frustrating for him because he was clinging to that whole old notion that if he could just do a little more each day, he could get better. And it didn't really work for him. He ultimately makes a breakthrough later in the decade when he accepts a model that is more like adaptation. It's accepting that he has limitations on his physical ability, but that there are ways that he can get around in the world that make those limitations less of a big deal for him and make him lead something that is closer to a normal life, or what appears to be outwardly a normal life. He never fully accepts it. I think that, a fascinating part of the story is that even as the years go by, it becomes clear to most of the people around him, especially his doctors, that he's not ever going to regain the ability to walk again. In his own mind, he never really fully accepts that. And there's a sort of really amazing dramatic moment in 1928 when he ultimately does sort of end the period of convalescence and recovery and return a little bit reluctantly to the political stage, running for governor of New York. He's being pressured by his then ally, Al Smith, who was running for president of the United States and wanted Franklin to run for governor in 1928 because he thought it would help his chances of carrying. Smith thought it would help his chances of carrying New York State. FDR resists him because in his mind, he still needed more time trying to regain the ability to walk. When he ultimately gives in to Smith's wishes, he's, in his mind, closing that door on ever walking again. He probably wasn't ever going to walk again, but in his mind, he was choosing the right moment in politics over ever walking again. And I think that's a really important moment in his psychology.
Now, if anyone has any questions, here's one. Cliff will bring a microphone around. And we also have one from someone virtually. Let's see, from Joan. Would you consider Franklin and Eleanor the first power couple?
Yeah. Oh, no, not the first power couple. I mean, I don't know, Antony and Cleopatra, Adam and Eve. But they were, I think, the kind of power couple that they formed in the 1920s is so innovative and interesting. And, I described earlier how they do reinvent their marriage in these years. And one of the things I love is that it's not a completely tidy story.
Not at all.
Yeah. I mean, she does they do reinvent their marriage, and she gets excited about this new person that her husband has become and this ability that he has to do good things on the issues she cares about. But her rage toward him and her resentment from the Lucy Mercer affair and from earlier in the marriage never really goes away. And you get to see it in the book. You see it sort of bubble up in these delicious moments. So, for example, in that 1928 campaign, when FDR is running for governor, he wins in November of 1928, the governorship. And it's a big surprise because the rest of the Democratic ticket does poorly. Al Smith is defeated in a landslide, and FDR surprises people by winning the governorship. So it's a big story the next day. And reporters come to Eleanor and they say, are you happy for your husband? And she says, how could I be happy when the rest of the ticket is done so poorly? And a couple days later, they ask her, they say, what do you think this will mean for your husband? And she says, well, I don't see how he can help but get fat. And I think, the timing on that is interesting because she always has, you see her old fears and resentments bubble up in moments where there's the potential for a change in her status, and there's a necessary renegotiation of this relationship between them. So in that moment, she's worried that she's going to have to go back to being a political wife who sits in the corner and smiles, while her husband gives the speeches. That's not obviously what happens either in the governorship or the presidency. They're always able to figure out a new way of doing things. And so yes, they are an incredible power couple. And I think what makes their story fascinating and inspiring is you get to see them sort of inventing what it means to be a power couple in real time. Yeah,
it is fascinating because you can see the structure, how they structure or attempt to structure, or the evolving structure of that relationship, which in a way almost feels contemporary, sort of. If you wash away all the mores of the time and even those of today, it is interesting that they make this partnership what maybe they didn't originally want it to be, but what certainly worked.
And I think it requires a certain, I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt has this incredible capacity for discipline and for hard work. What her husband has to learn in these years, she brings into the marriage, this sort of ability to put her head down and experience things that are unpleasant. And that, I think that's a key component here, is they're very disciplined about this. She can sort of, in the governorship years, she is the first lady of New York State, but she also has like 3 different jobs of her own, and she divides up her week, and she's sort of always coming and going, and it's in a way that it makes me exhausted just thinking about it. But she's able to do it.
She said her hobby was work.
Yeah, I mean, she describes. You read these letters, and she's like, "Oh, I've had such a restful afternoon. I've written 3 editorials, and then I made dinner, and then we had someone over, and it's like I would need to check into a institution for a few days afterwards. But for her, that is rest, because she's otherwise just going, and that's, I mean, she's an incredible figure in that way." Yeah.
And we have another question over here.
I guess it's not working. I can do without a mic, I think.
Yeah.
I want to thank both of you for a fascinating interview. You've done a good job.
Thank you.
I've always seen Roosevelt as kind of a family man, especially going back to Campobello and other things, that people were younger and everything. Did you ascertain any influence that the children had on Franklin after the change of politics?
Yeah, I mean,
Well, you didn't mention it at all. Is there anything that would be mentioned with the children?
there's a. I
So
mean,
for our virtual audience, how did the children, or was there any influence from the children on FDR after polio? I think roughly I captured that.
and it's a great question. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the children and their experience, because I think it's fascinating. In a lot of ways, it's at times somewhat heartbreaking, because they had. So Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had 6 children, 5 of whom lived past infancy, and they their experience of Franklin before polio was as this incredibly active father. He was taking them off on these nature hikes and getting down and wrestling with them on the floor. He had been, for all intents and purposes, an only child. He had a much older half sibling, but he was raised pretty much on his own, and he'd always wanted to have a big family with lots of kids. And when you look at the early years of their family life, he sort of is the 6th child, with playing games with them. So that's what they knew of their father. So then when he gets ill and he loses the ability to move freely, it's a huge loss for them. And then around all of that is this climate of fear, because polio was a disease that was associated with children. So particularly in the first weeks, there's this idea of, let's keep him away from the children because we don't want them to get sick. So that's all somewhat unknown to them, but they know that there's a lot of worry and fear around their father. And there's a certain distance that gets put in there in those first months. There's a moment that they describe in the first months of his recovery where they're still quite traumatized, I think, by what's happened to their father. And they go into his bedroom, and they're sort of tentative, and he pulls up the blanket to show them his legs, which were quite transformed, and he starts showing each of the muscles, giving its Latin name, and then he describes the kind of progress that he's feeling. And his son Jimmy would later write about this, and he would say, "Oh, I can really feel that muscle coming back." And they would say, and Jimmy said, "We believed him because he believed it." And I think that's, you think about what he then does in the presidency. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That's a pretty audacious thing to say, but people believed him when he said that because he really believed it himself. And I think that's, the two things are very closely related.
Well, that's interesting too, because people in the public afterwards in the 30s and 40s also didn't think of him as being paralyzed. He projected an image that seems so have such vitality. So like the children, it's very similar in the sense of people. He believed it. He believed in himself enough that others would follow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both. To me, it's really, I think you have to understand though that people did know that he had had this experience, and that's such an important underlying context for all of these great moments of hope that he brings to the country. So I think a lot about his speech accepting the Democratic nomination in 1932. And he says in that speech, he says, out of every crisis, mankind rises with some share of greater knowledge, of higher purpose, and of purer decency. And, you know, you think about the moment in which he's saying that, which is the depths of the Depression. It's the summer of 1932. Millions of people are out of work. They can't put food on their table. But he says that sort of, you know, this idea that not only are you going to be okay, you're going to come out of this with greater knowledge and purer purpose. And they believed him. And I think that's because they knew that he had gone through a moment of great setback in his own life, and he had emerged from that as well. And so he was a credible figure delivering that message.
Oh, another question. Thanks. From Stephen. Why did he finally admit publicly his disability in his speech to Congress in 1945?
So that's an amazing moment because, you know, when I'd finished working on this project, my book ends on the first day of Roosevelt's presidency. But then I went back and looked at the presidency and looked for sort of evidence of his talking about the experience of polio, and it's almost impossible to find. He goes back to Campobello at the end of the 100 days in 1933. It's his first time back there since he had taken ill in 1921. So clearly, that's like it's an intentional decision he makes, and it's filled with meaning. And he arrives there. He comes ashore. The people on the island of Campobello have put together a celebration. The press is all there. And he says in his remarks, he says, I started coming to this island as a small boy. I came here every summer until 1921. Since then, there has been a gap. And that's all he says. But then you have this moment at the end of the presidency where he's returning from the Yalta conference, and he's weeks away from death. And his body, I mean, everyone around him in those weeks and months describes just this change that has come over him, and this concern that he's just not able to sort of carry through the obligations of his job on a day-to-day basis. So he goes before the Congress to sort of report on Yalta. And he says at the beginning of his speech, he's normally when he would give speeches, he would sort of prop himself up on the podium so that it looked like he was standing. He gave that speech seated, and he'll say, you'll forgive me for giving the speech seated, but it makes it much easier when I have 10 pounds of steel carrying around 10 pounds of steel on my legs. I think that it was, to me, when I look at why does he choose that moment, that's a particularly difficult moment to get inside of Franklin Roosevelt's head, because you have to really think about how much does he know about how sick he is and what his prospects are. So I think the easiest interpretation is really just the physical exhaustion that he had gone through. The curtain came down a little bit, and he had to sort of explain himself. It's
interesting too. Our first director here was on the floor of the chamber that day, and he said right after the president died, just a few weeks later, that what struck him is though, yeah, he looked terrible. He was obviously ill, but they just thought he would keep going.
Yeah.
Again, projecting on some level this idea that he would carry through.
Yeah, I mean, if you read people's accounts or news coverage from the day that Roosevelt died, it was a national trauma for the pure shock of it. Mm-hmm. In part because he had been president for so long. There were people who were in their 30s who couldn't really remember anyone else but Franklin Roosevelt. being president, or never had a chance to vote for anyone other than Franklin Roosevelt on the Democratic side. But it was a shock. Like, people couldn't, we think of it, we know the history of how sick he was and how, and the strain that those years took on him. It seems amazing that he lasted as long as he did. But in the moment, people were shocked. And that's in part because of this incredible ability that he has, even in a moment of physical exhaustion, to project a sense of ease and optimism. And that's something that came quite naturally to him from birth. And it was something that got really solidified by the experience of polio.
Well, thank you very much for being here with us today. You'll be signing books, please. And we really appreciate it. It's a wonderful book. And we hope to have you back sometime.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you all. And thank you so much for having me on Franklin's book.
Thank you.